Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's talk. We're very lucky today to have Margaret McKenna talk to us, and Margaret is, I believe, our youngest speaker so far. She's 23 years old and has graduated last year in June from Sorbonne University in Paris, where she did her master's degree in modern history. And her research thesis was on the Chevalier de Johnstone, and most of you will know that we've got the Johnstone Memoirs in the museum exhibition. I'm very lucky. It's one of my personal favorites as well. And I was lucky enough to meet Margaret last summer as well, when she came in as part of her research project to work with the manuscript. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to everything that you've got to tell us, and maybe some future plans. So I'll just hand over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. So thank you very much for having me here tonight to talk about a subject that is quite close to my heart, because that has occupied a large part of my time the last 2 years. So I apologize in advance to everyone if my English is not very good. My name does not reflect at all the reality. I'm not bilingual. So if you don't understand something, don't hesitate to stop me. So yeah, I finished, just a quick introduction of myself. I finished in June 2022 a master's degree in modern history, and gave a thesis on the Chevalier de Johnstone. So I am no longer a student, but I wish to really to continue to work on him and work on this subject. Very interesting. So my first dissertation 2 years ago was on the British in the French colonies in the 18th century. This is how I came across the Scotsman, so Johnstone, who was the subject of my second dissertation, so last year. My dissertation was entitled exactly Memoirs of Exile, a Jacobite in the French Empire, James Johnstone, 1719, around 1800. So the origin of this character echoed my own, the fascinating historical period and the existence of consistent sources about on his subject pushed me on this study with the great help of three very excellent professors in Sorbonne University. I tried to analyze the consequent legacy left by Johnstone, namely the memoirs. Nowhere else can these be read in their entirety than in the Clan Macpherson Museum. At first, I was able to find on the internet parts transcribed according to the original manuscript or translated into English to work on. And then I was very lucky to discover by chance, to be exact, thanks to Facebook, the existence of the original manuscript, which is not listed anywhere and which is kept in your home, so in the Highlands. I took a plane as quickly as I could last year to discover this beautiful treasure, and that was hidden from the world. So it is this journey that brings me today to tell you about this intriguing man whose story is jealously preserved in the Highlands. So just here to tell you about a story that embraces yours, because that of the Jacobites, and ours, that of French people who welcomed them in their home, and whom I represent today. In short, that of two countries that have been friends, very friends from the Middle Ages, and which have a very special bond until today. So, who was Johnstone? It is time, I think, to get in the heart of the matter. Elements of his life and character have been gleaned either directly from the memoirs or from sources concerning him. The latter are mainly in France, in the archive center in Aix-en-Provence, so in southern France, which centralize all the colonial archives. In the e-series, there is a complete field about Johnstone, consisting of letters he sent or received from French administration, but also letters from protectors or from people interested in Johnstone after his death. To these kind of sources can be added some Canadian and Scottish works, which briefly summarize Johnston's life. So Johnstone was, as known as the Chevalier de Johnstone, was born and baptized in Edinburgh on the 25 July 1790. We have quite limited information about his nuclear family. His father, James Johnstone, was a merchant in the Scottish capital, and his mother, Cecilia Hewitt, was, we think, a member of the local nobility. The Chevalier de Johnstone is the eighth child of this middle-class couple and their only son. Of his sisters, we know only two, Jane and Cecilia. Jane, who married John Leslie, and Cecilia, who married the Lord Rollo. Sources and memoirs tell us that the family was Catholic and not Protestant, and that they supported the House of Stuart from the beginning at the end of the 17th century. So Johnstone tells us in his memoirs that he was quite a turbulent young man, not very industrious, and fond of all kinds of pleasures. He was, in fact, a 19th century libertine gentleman, impetuous, obstinate, passionate, but still concerned by honor and probity. He had a taste for parties from his adolescence, which he kept until his arrival in Paris in 46. Thus, he testified, and I quote here Johnstone, "The pleasures of this city soon made me forget my past sorrows and even blinded me to the future." So he had several gallant affairs, notably with a certain Peggy in London in 1738, yes, whom he met again in 1746. The many pages he devoted to her, reveal the poet's soul. Unfortunately, his exile in France, in Paris, in 1746, broke this love affair, and Johnstone, no doubt out of spite, never married. So the son's libertinism exasperated the father, who on several occasions quarreled quite violently with him. And Johnstone, we can see it in his memoirs, was particularly marked by this severity. So when he wasn't hiding from his father or for political reasons, reading or losing himself in the pleasures that life can offer him, Johnstone was traveling. His taste for adventure is not to be denied. It is interesting to note that his profile, so Johnstone's profile, fits well with those fashionable in 18th century in Scotland. Indeed, adventurism was in fashion, and pushed sailors, soldiers, and gentlemen to cross around Europe. Thus, they joined the old continent to discover France and Germany, without forgetting, of course, to set a foot in Spain or in Italy, and even for some to embark towards more Oriental countries like Russia. So here you can see a little table of all the journeys listed in Johnston's life, whether they were wanted or imposed by family or political circumstances. Of Johnston's journeys, for example, we can remember the one he made in Russia in 1738, a journey that can be described as initiatory, made possible by the presence of a very highly placed uncle. I think he was the brother of his mother, who was in that distant island. So throughout his youth, Johnstone developed a very big taste for ideals and service, politics and arms. He was to be around against all his life. At first, he wanted to join the Russian army, but these plans were thwarted by a reluctant father, and Johnson had to wait until Bonnie Prince-Charlie expedition in 1745 to really start a proper military career. Of course, here I must say a word about this expedition on the Johnston's political commitment, because it is key to understand our protagonist's typical journey. So the Chevalier de Johnstone was a fervent Jacobite, I think you understood that, and took part in the last rebellion of this party in 1745 and 1746. So just the term Jacobite comes from the Latin Jacobus, meaning James. It was the name given to all the supporters of the House of Stuart, exiled in 1689, who wished to restore James II of England and Ireland and 7 of Scotland to the throne of Britain. James II had been dethroned by a coup d'etat because of his Catholic convictions, his pro-French policies, and his absolutist pretensions. So the Jacobites came from a variety of backgrounds, some motivated by religion, others by politics, or others, a little bit like, I think, Johnstone, just by ideals and adventurism. Thousands of Irish, English, and Scots, noble and commoners alike, were united in the same cause. The fighting continued until the Jacobites were defeated for good at Culloden in Scotland on the 16th April 1746. For the Scots, this battle, Culloden, marked the end of their independence from England and the beginning of a very sad period of national restraint and harsh repression. For many, exile was the only way to escape the rest, so the English soldiers. And in this context, France was a major host country, as it was Catholic and had never hidden its support for the Stuarts. So back to our dear Johnstone, against all the advice of his father, who was quite reluctant to see his son hanging from a rope, the then 26-year-old adventurer secretly left home to join Bonnie Prince-Charlie, so the last Stuart suitor, who was waiting in the early summer of 1745 in the northwestern Highlands with a quite small, discreet army to launch a decisive expedition against the English in the service of the House of Orange, so the sworn enemy. It was not long before Johnstone became a captain in the Prince's army. He took part in many major battles, such as Prestonpans. But it's quite interesting to note that he wasn't present at Culloden. But this defeat, so Culloden did it was to determine his entire future, since, like so many others, he went into exile, hiding as best as he could. In his memoirs, he tells how he had to disguise himself, for example, as a traveling merchant to avoid being recognized on the roads leading to London and then to the continent. The theme of disguise is quite interesting to note. It's here. It's a common one in all exile stories of this time, showing us in passing that Johnson is quite well aware of all his history when he is writing his memoirs. So after a short stop in Holland, where there was quite a large community of Scottish in exile, Johnstone fled to Paris, the capital of France, and his political exile was not to end until his death, so around 1800. When he was in France, Johnstone managed to enter the army, but contrary to the French government's promise at the time, he did not achieve a rank equivalent to that which he had in Scotland. So in Scotland, remember, he was a captain in the Prince army. In France, he became an ensign in the navy. So and France, which was less and less willing to be involved in losing Jacobite affairs and more willing to show English the ropes, sent him, like many others, away to the colony. This betrayal of France was quite a violent disappointment for Johnstone, who was only to speak negatively of the Franco-Scottish alliance, which had to be thought to be more solid and beautiful. So he arrived in French Canada in 1750 and remained there during the 7 Years' War, an almost global war, which ran from 1756 to 1763, and which mainly pitted Austria allied with Britain against Prussia allied with France. So just a few words about this Canadian exile, which occupies a large part of the memoirs of Johnstone's memoir. On the Quays of Rochefort in France in 1750, ready to embark for Ile Royale, the author already knew that he was going to, and I quote Johnstone here, to the worst country in the world. His beginnings in Wisborough, the capital of Ile Royale, were marked by the strong feeling of humiliation felt by the author, and I quote here again, the only one of the Scots in Wisborough, vilely demoted to a non-sign by the ignorance of Monsieur Rouillet, who was the Minister of War and Colonies in France at this time. So this predisposition to a bad state is exacerbated by poverty, with Johnstone living on, and I quote, £480 a year, which was not enough to pay for pension in the most miserable gargot of Wisborough. The author paints a pitiful picture of his Wisborough life as a very describe this pitiful life as a veritable purgatory. And the ultimate inconvenience for him was the bad food, consisting of desalted cod and bacon whips and wanting salted butter and bad oil. So really a terrible purgatory for him, where he had to withdraw from the world and its pleasure to live as a solitary philosopher with only a servant for companionship and only fishing and reading. So he was very alone. In 1758, he escaped from this really miserable life, thanks in a way to the English aggression against the French colony. It was, the beginning of the 7 Years' War in the American colony. Louisbourg had just fallen into their hands. 2 years of war followed, which were for our protagonist certainly exhausting, but milder than all the previous years. So during this time, when not hiding, fleeing, or fighting the enemy, Johnstone stood by two great men of the colony, Montcalm, then Lévis, successive leaders of the French armies in Canada. He was their aide-de-camp, but he was also a military engineer, strategist, and confidant. Just we have to note that it is quite difficult to verify Johnston's claims of direct involvement in the defense of France in Canada, as we have quite few sources on internal armed events. And furthermore, the letters we have of Lévis and Montcalm say very little about Johnstone. So whole Johnston's love of the military art is fully put to use in this period of his life. He does not hide in the memoirs all his love for reading military strategy and for cartography too. Just a word about Johnston's reading. It is important to understand that writing history, especially war history, is not something that can be just improvised. The author, Johnstone, certainly trained himself from his personal experiences, but he supported this effort by reading military works and treatises, such as the work of Julius Caesar or Turenne and Vauban, both very great French engineers and soldiers. And he did not hesitate to support his statements with fundamental texts, such as the discourse on the current state of politics and military science in Europe by François Apolline Guibert. The Chevalier de Johnstone drew his military science mainly from ancient works and authors of the 17th and 18th century. And a word or two about Johnstone's cartographic talents. His memoirs are a real historical nugget. Johnstone made several maps of the battlefield in Scotland and Canada, and developed strategies. On the PowerPoint, you can see the map of the siege of Illinois, organized by the English in 1760. Johnstone drew the place to which he had the various positions of the armed forces, and the legends explaining the strategy chosen to resist. So all Johnstone's maps are very clear, precise, and give us additional knowledge of the course of military events, both Jacobite and Franco-Canadian. In 1760, French Canada fell definitively to the English. Johnstone was sent back to France, and the chapter of his life of adventures came to an end. Johnstone will not tell what happened to him from then on. Only sources complementary to the memoirs give us some knowledge of the last decades of his life, which were probably spent in misery in Paris. So he went from disappointment to disappointment, trying in vain to make the Ministry of War and the Colonies aware of his past and present military value in order to obtain a pension and the colonel's commission. He just, according to letters and from Johnson and from the administration, Johnson obtained the Cross of St. Louis, a French honorary award, which gave him the title of Chevalier. So he was very unhappy with France's lack of recognition of him and the contempt expressed towards Montcalm and his men, who were, it's true, but who were unable to save the American colony. So the years of exile in France were an opportunity for him to write his memoirs. He only had to return to Edinburgh once, and it was for inheritance reasons, but he died in France after the French Revolution, and we think probably around 1800. So as you can see, this life story is mainly due to his memoirs. Just a small historiographical point here. The term memoirs was given by the author himself as a general title of all his work. This literary genre applies to narrative of a historical and sometimes literary nature, in which the author, called the memoirist, is directly involved. So memoirs are thus a clever mixture of historical testimony and autobiography, made up of eventful or anecdotal episodes of sometimes public, sometimes private nature. The genre of memoirs has its roots in antiquity and has continued to develop until the present day, reaching a peak in France at the end of the Ancien Regime, so during the 18th century, and in the 19th century. The genre of memoirs found its place in historical and literary studies in the 1970s. So at that time, the problems of social history were renewed after the craze of quantitative series and macro history, which refers to historiographical works that analyze historical events by taking into account broader contextual elements. Place was given to the study of individuals and to micro-history, which aims to understand history by taking into account all possible scales from micro to macro. So while history studies of memoirs became more and more numerous at the end of the 20th century, the literary aspect was also valued. Quite interesting to note. So our protagonist is the author of memoirs. As mentioned above, he recounts his involvement in the Jacobite rebellion in 1745 and 1746 in Scotland, as well as in the French Navy in Canada between 1750 and 1760. His work is divided into several manuscripts or chapters. We do not know the order in which the different parts were written. However, the Chevalier de Johnstone titled them in order to establish a chronology between them and to facilitate reading. So his first volume is entitled The Scottish War. He integrated the second volume, straddling the Scottish history and his arrival in France, then in Canada. And the third and final volume has several end papers titled The War of Ile Royale and the Siege of Louisbourg in 1758, and the campaign of 1759, containing an impartial and military examination of that campaign to serve as a justification of the Chevalier de Johnstone. The latter is divided into several subsections, which I will not detail here. So, proportionally, the 153 pages of Franco-Canadian narrative are not much for the 320 pages of Jacobite narrative, but the quality of the work and the richness of the testimony are nonetheless equal between the two main parts. The original manuscript, as we can see it today in the Clan Macpherson Museum, has the appearance of a book in which the different manuscripts are linked together. A very fascinating article on the formal aspects of the book appeared in the annual journal of the Clan Macpherson Museum, so the Craig Do. David McNeil, Associate Professor of English at Dalhousie University, studied certain material evidence to confirm the originality of the French manuscript, such as the origin of the paper or the handwriting, and also the similarities and differences with an English manuscript of the same memoirs kept in the archives of Vincennes near Paris. So, according to McNeil, this is the English manuscript is the first version of Johnston's work. The addition of various discoveries on the English and French manuscripts makes it possible to date the latter from 1772. So externally, the French manuscript is striking because of clear legibility of its writing and its neatness, which suggests that it is the final work of a long writing process. There are also a few notes in the margin for the reader. I think probably the last touches that our Scotsman incorporated into his work. Despite the care it took in composing his work, the Chevalier de Johnstone did not deign to leave a final signature. We only find his name on some of the maps he drew and includes in his manuscript. So, what makes Johnston's work so interesting his unique account of the life of a Scottish Jacobite exiled in France, but also his look at the Franco-Scottish relationship, and Franco-Canadian history. And finally, his ability to let us into his state of mind and to reveal his feelings. He navigates between originality with a self-disclosure, just in fashion in the 18th century, a unique narrative and unpublished maps, and commonplace with anecdotes, probably exaggerated to appear more sensational, responding to the need to attract readers, or fashionable stories, such as stories of disguise to escape the enemy. He handedly wrote his memoirs with publication in mind. He wanted to document a crucial time for his Scottish and French contemporaries, but also to justify his numerous claims to financial recognition and honorary titles for his service to the Stuarts and Bourbons by writing a text that would enhance his status and emphasize the injustice of his situation. So it is really important to realize that the memoirs studied are not always objective, and that it is sometimes difficult to distinguish the true from the false and the disinterested from the interested. The author never ceases to surprise us as he goes on with the pages by structuring different testimonies, each one more enriching than the last. Sometimes public, sometimes private. They take us into the world of the Enlightenment, of soldiers and battles, of the corruption of some and the heroism of others, of the diaspora too and its misfortunes. Johnstone really succeeds in providing a pseudo-historical critique of political events as he experienced them, while placing himself at the center of the narrative in an undisguised attempt to evoke his personal feelings and thoughts. The journey of the Johnstone manuscript over the last 2 centuries has occupied much of my dissertation work last year, which I will summarize very briefly here. So since 1820, when it was deposited in London, the Chevalier de Johnstone's manuscript has traveled widely. While some translated it into English and published it, such as the Longman editions from 1820 to 1822, others continued to care for it. Sources agree that it returned to the Johnstone's family during the 19th century. It was bought by Hugh Fraser Leslie, a descendant of Johnstone through his sister Jane, who, if you well remember, married a certain John Leslie. So Hugh Fraser Leslie presented, according to a letter we can find in the manuscript, the memoirs to the Surgeon General William Campbell McLean for preservation in his family. This was successful as it reached the doctor's grandson, Brigadier General Alexander Duncan Macpherson. So on the death of the latter, his widow donated the manuscript to her clan's museum by marriage, where it remains the pride, I hope, of its curator to this day. So we don't know, perhaps a distant family connection or perhaps a friendship between the Chevalier de Johnstone's grandnephew and General Macpherson's grandfather may account for the transfer of these memoirs, as Hugh Fraser Leslie was not without siblings to whom they might have gone. So in parallel with this journey, English translation of the memoirs or partial transcriptions from the original manuscript appeared both in England and Canada. So probably by chance, the manuscript has somewhat followed the path of openness that the Chevalier de Johnstone wished to give it. It circulated between men and institutions, accessible to different audiences at different times. It is really unfortunate that its influence was limited not only geographically but also temporally. Indeed, Johnstone was quite soon forgotten, and it was what a pity. All that is missing now, I think, is the publication of the original manuscript, the memoir of the original memoir, to rediscover this character, both for, the layman who wants to read about historical adventures, and for the historian who wants to feed his work with new examples. So I will stop here, but there is much more to be said about Johnstone and many historical and literary subjects to be developed. I hope that I have given you a better understanding of a character in your history, whose life has fascinated me so much. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for bringing us his life closer, and also his work, and explaining the historiographic importance that his manuscript has to us, and I really enjoy the examples of the maps. I always enjoy looking at them in the museum as well. They're so detailed, and there's so much to discover. Thank you so much. And I would hand over to our audience in case somebody has any questions for Margaret.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ask away.
I didn't get the impression that his status as a youth, his family, was anything special. He wasn't an aristocrat, but then neither was he somebody that was going to be a common foot soldier. He came up presumably through recognition, to be a captain, and in the flyleaf of the book that you showed that he published in English, he said he was the aide-de-camp to Lord Murray. Now, I mean, that's a pretty significant post for the general of the army. He was an assistant aide-de-camp to Charles Edward Stuart himself. You could say that he was a young man, an adventurer, almost after Culloden, without a country. And he traveled around the world in the army of France. He went into the service of France. Do you think that he was typical of his generation and the type of person that he became, a middle-ranking officer after Culloden, that would journey the world in the service of other countries? He'd lost his country, his cause had been lost, so he went to America. But other Scotsmen could have gone to Russia or Spain or Germany. So was he sort of typical of the men that were in the prince's army that had to flee?
Yeah, I think many men were like him after Culloden, quite forgotten by the aristocrats and by France, and many men lose their privileges when they came in France or in other countries in exile. So Johnstone,
presumably he was a skillful soldier.
Sorry?
Presumably he was a skillful soldier.
Yeah. Yes. And Johnstone is really interesting for that. He testified for many men like him. That it was, I think he was the only one to write about quite a common history, quite a common, history.
Yeah, that's the uniqueness, that he then had the further skill or interest to put it down in his memoirs.
Yeah, I think yes.
Thank you. Are there any further questions within the audience? You're welcome to type them into the chat as well, if that's easier for you. Don't see anything. Well, if that is not the case, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Margaret. I really enjoyed this. And you kindly mentioned a previous article in the Plan journal in Craigdhu. Margaret will be following up with one in the next issue, which is being printed now, pretty much, as far as I know. So there should be some more to read. And yeah, that was really great. Thank you so much. And I hope I'll see some of you again for the next talks.
Thank you very much,
More coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your evening, everyone.